Hey everyone, Screenplay Archaeology host KiramidHead here. Just wanted to get some plugs out of the way before the new episode starts. We have now come under the umbrella of Fandom Live Media, which is also the home of the Table Reads podcast, which is a fellow unproduced script podcast, where they read said scripts out in full over several episodes. So if you like this subject matter and you're curious about a different format for it, definitely check those guys out. Not the least reason which is because you'll be paying tribute to my new podcast overlords, and that can only have a benefit. Also, check out the Shelved Film podcast, which covers similar subject matters. They're not tied in with us, but I want you to go check them out. I want to make that recommendation because I'm just a nice guy like that. And as usual, be sure to check us out on social media on Facebook, Tumblr, and Twitter. We're on almost every means of listening to podcasts. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, a bunch of other places, especially now that I'm on a new platform which can distribute it to a whole ton of different places. So be sure to check out Spotify, Google Podcasts, stuff like that as well. And also a couple of things I want to throw in at the end. We do have a Patreon page. There's not much there. I can't really think of a rewards tier at the moment. And also, I have a Discord server that's been put together for a while, so if you want to show up and try that, as long as you're not an asshole, nothing will happen to you. You won't get kicked out. Just follow the rules. You'll be good. Check that link out down below. And with that, enjoy the episode. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I am your host, KiramidHead, and tonight we are going to be looking at The Lost Boys: The Beginning, a prequel script written to, the classic 80s vampire movie, The Lost Boys. And the idea of doing this for the current episode was inspired by the fact that a couple weeks back, Joel Schumacher, the director of The Lost Boys and numerous other films, passed away. And so I figured this would be a nice little way of sort of tying into that, doing a little tribute to the man since he's credited with story on this script. Now, before I get into the episode and give you like a basic summary, talk about the background and all that, I just want to quickly point out once again that there was an issue with Spreaker and my original iTunes page got taken down, and so I've resubmitted it. The show is back up there. Just make sure you go back and refollow and check things out if you listen there, so keep that in mind. Now, The Lost Boys: The Beginning, the basic plot summary is that it takes place in 1906 in San Francisco, and we get to meet the characters of the Lost Boys before they became vampires, David and all of them. I'll go through the names as we go along. And they're, living on the streets, picking pockets for a living, and among other things. And they're getting victimized by other criminal groups, and this vampire rolls into town who's from Europe, and they run into him and try to rob him, and that leads to them getting initiated into vampire-dom or vampire-hood, whatever word you want to use for it. So that's the basic plot. There's a few twists along the way and stuff you might not expect. Now, The Lost Boys, the original, is one of those classic sort of vampire movies that you're going to hear about it if you're into that subgenre, and you'll definitely see it. And it's one of like 3 80s vampire movies that's sort of like the pinnacle that people always bring up. It's that, Fright Night, and the original Near Dark. And I'm going to have to come back to Near Dark in a bit, but I'll let that sit for now. And it's just a really cool, stylish movie. Lots of really good performances in it. Like, Corey Haim, Corey Feldman, Kiefer Sutherland as the vampire David, who's the main vampire you see throughout thing. Jason Patrick, who has been in some other things, but he's really good in The Lost Boys as well. And it's just a really fun, funny, but still bloodthirsty R-rated vampire movie. It balances the different tones really well, and it's a really good-looking movie, really well directed by Joel Schumacher, who shows what he can really do when he's not, making a very heavily studio-mandated bet. And it's just a really cool, fun movie, one of the best vampire movies And I've not seen the sequels they did make, at least as of yet. I know a fair amount about The Tribe. I know it brings in Kiefer Sutherland's brother to play like the main vampire in that, and it's kind of like a remake, but also a sequel. Mainly what I've heard is that the Tribe is really, really bad, but at the third movie, The Thirst, is surprisingly decent. And I looked it up, and it's apparently written by the same people, which is as The Tribe, which is strange to me. But I might check out The Thirst down the line. But a follow-up to The Lost Boys is something that was considered for ages after the first movie came out, because it was a massive hit when it released, or at least it was enough of a hit that there was discussions of a follow-up. So you had this idea for the prequel that we're going to be talking about in a bit. And for years and years and years, there was talk of a sequel. And eventually Joel Schumacher kind of pushed that to the side and decided to do sort of like a spin-off reboot thing called The Lost Girls, which would have had all new characters, only with a female cast, which could have worked, might not have. But I know his excuse. I know like his logic behind it was, he said, all the Lost Boys are all dead, and the other cast members are too old to do a movie in that exact same vein or something like that. So he decided to spin off its own direction, and that eventually ended up going nowhere. Like that collapsed around 2001-ish. So throughout the late 80s and into the 90s and into the early 2000s, there was work on a follow-up, and eventually it ended up as a couple of straight-to-video movies. I find it interesting how that ended up working out. But the script we're looking at today was written by, it's called The Lost Boys: The Beginning, and it was written by Eric Red, and it says on here, story by Eric Red and Joel Schumacher. And now Eric Red is an interesting choice to bring into this because he was the writer of Near Dark, which was, a direct competitor to The Lost Boys when it came out. I think they released very close together. There were both these kind of stylish 80s vampire movies, and The Lost Boys won at the box office, but Near Dark is still very well thought of. It's a film which I've seen twice. I saw it once years ago, didn't really care for it. Went back to it recently, and I liked it a bit more, but I still feel like it has a number of problems, especially in the third act. But I won't say it's a bad movie. I'll never go out there and say it. I think it's an interesting film enough that it's worth a look. But Eric Red also wrote The Hitcher, which is a fantastic horror thriller, and, just go watch that movie. And he's written some other stuff that I haven't seen. Like, I've been meaning to see Bad Moon just to see what his take on werewolves would be like, but I've never actually gotten around to that. And things like Blue Steel and some other things, which I've just never managed to see. But like I said, so it's interesting that he ends up attached to this Lost Boys follow-up when he was writing the competitor movie that lost out back in 87. I think that's a very interesting coincidence that happened. And maybe it wasn't a coincidence. I don't actually know what happened here, how this came to be. But it seems like a pretty, but it's just an interesting kind of mix that happened. Very weird, very strange that these two things would kind of come together in this way. And if the movie had gotten made, wow. And it's interesting that Eric Red writes this because in Near Dark, there's moments where the characters will talk about like their backstories and stuff, and it makes it clear how old they are. And you get the idea that maybe he was thinking at some point of a prequel. Maybe he could have written that. And I know he wrote a treatment for a sequel, but there's like sowing the seeds for a prequel the way The Lost Boys does, where it mentions San Francisco in the past. And we'll talk about that as we go along. So it's interesting that Eric Red would write this, which is kind of a Western vampire movie in a sense, when the seeds of that are kind of sown in his own vampire movie. It's very interesting. And so getting into the script, we start in 1906 on board a ship heading for San Francisco, and there's a largely unseen vampire emerges from a crate filled with dirt and marked with a Romanian crest, and it slaughters the entire crew before flying in a POV shot towards the coast. So we have a Dracula-inspired opening here on board a boat, on board a ship of a vampire killing a crew off and, sleeping in, the dirt coffins. And then we get it mixed in with, the style of the Lost Boys. Because in the Lost Boys, you have those POV flying sequences, but you also have scenes where they're attacking people and you don't quite see what's going on. You see it in glimpses. So already we're getting off on an interesting start. And so we then go to San Francisco. And here's where one of the flaws in the basic writing of this script crops up, is that in the scene descriptions, it will say San Francisco, but then there's multiple times where the dialogue refers to them being in Santa Carla, which is the town from the original movie, if you haven't seen it. And it kind of conflicts because they end up going to Santa Carla later, so they're definitely supposed to be in San Francisco in these opening scenes. So that's something that would need to be fixed. Where we meet David and the future Lost Boys, who are Paul, Marco, the Alex Winter character, Jasper and Dwayne, living on the streets and making money off of picking pockets and fights. Now, Jasper is new. He's not in the original movie, and we'll talk about that a bit towards the end. they're living on the streets and they're making money off of picking pockets and fights. And we see Paul is doing like a bare knuckle boxing match on the docks. He's fighting this guy, and David slips him some like metal cylinders to put in his fists to make him hit harder and kind of fix the match. So you see how they're getting by on their wits and stuff like that. So that's interesting to see that they're kind of in a similar outsider status to what they would be as vampires. So that's an interesting thing to point out. And so we get sort of an establishing character moment with David where he refuses to rob a man with young children. So we get the idea that there is a certain nobility to him in life that he doesn't have later on. And he gets shaken down by Lomax, who is the crime boss of the local docks, who keeps telling them he doesn't want them around. So he takes all the money they just made away from them. And that's when the ship from the opening drifts into port completely abandoned. So the way it just plows into the dock there, I was actually kind of a little bit of Nosferatu, but it did remind me a little bit of a Jurassic Park 2 where the boat just goes boom into the San Diego docks. Of course, this would have been written before that, so that was completely coincidental. And by the way, I don't know exactly where in the timeline of this movie getting made that this script was written. I'm guessing it's, early on into the 90s because, the actors would still have to be young enough to do it, but there's no date on the script, so I can't say for sure. And okay, so a ring with a comet engraved on it falls from the mast, and Marco takes it for himself. So he looked at that ring and went, "Excellent!" I'm going to try and keep the Bill and Ted jokes to a minimum in this. David then spots a well-dressed European gentleman named Vlad, who's named in the scene descriptions, walking through the crowd, and the group follows him, looking to rob him. So we get these references to Romania. We get, the Demeter-inspired opening here, and the guy is named Vlad. Is this going where you think it's going? Yes, but not quite. You'll see as we go along. So they tail Vlad into a dark alley, and he confronts Marco about the ring, saying it bears the symbol of the Order of the Dragon, claiming it as his own. And he starts squeezing Marco's hand and breaking it a little. And then a scuffle breaks out, and David shoots and seemingly kills the European man with a derringer he keeps hidden up his sleeve. And the group panics as none of them have killed before, and David elects to take Vlad's purse full of gold coins and his wallet stuffed with cash, and buy horses so they can head down the coast to the new resort at Santa Carla where they can lay low in style. And I like that as a moment that as a human, David he's not a killer yet, and that the bloodlust is something that comes to him as a vampire. I think that's a very, it's kind of an unexpected turn to take, because you wonder if David was maybe more of a bastard or not in the original movie. And here you're kind of learning that he had come that way. And so I like how this script kind of plays around with some of that stuff. And so they buy horses, ride down to Santa Carla, and they check into the hotel. Now, in the original movie, they talk about how the cave where the Lost Boys live, that's their lair, it's on the site of where this hotel used to be before the great San Francisco earthquake, knocked it down. So so if you've seen the original movie, you can kind of see where the script is going to be going eventually. But, I'm just throwing that out there. So this is taking what was mentioned in that movie and using it in a relatively interesting manner. And they check into the hotel where they go to dinner, clumsily putting on coats and ties in order to eat in the formal dining room. And during dinner, David's head is turned by the lovely Princess Anastasia Rostov is her last name. I forgot to write that down, but I just now remembered it. Daughter of the Grand Duke of Russia. And despite his friend's encouragement, he refuses to go over and talk to her, considering the princess to be too high class for him. So you're seeing a more sensitive, almost kind of intellectual side of David here than you would have seen before. So you're getting a little bit more of an idea of what his original character. And so there then follows a scene where this is kind of a subplot where I'm a little bit iffy on on it when it starts, but it's used well enough in the script that it doesn't become too annoying. Where we meet two teenage Romanian waiters, Victor and Radu Frogier. So yes, we have historical precursors to the Frog Brothers in this. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I was iffy on this for a while when we get to more of their scenes. But for now you kind of get the idea. For now, I'll just leave it. And they throw out a 5-year-old boy who is stealing bottles of root beer. Now, if you've seen the original movie, you can maybe figure out who this is, and you wouldn't know this if this were an actual movie you were watching, but the script just flat out tells you that this kid is Grandpa from the original in the scene description, because you get that scene at the end of the movie where Grandpa is like talks about how like he always hated all the damn vampires in Santa Carla, so it's this twist that he's known about these guys all along. And you're like, what the hell? This is kind of filling in how he knows about the vampires, but I kind of wish the script left that as a twist for the end instead of just going, oh, by the way, here's Grandpa. And what's hilarious about it is that they only ever call him Grandpa. Like the dialogue header, it's Grandpa. The scene description, it's Grandpa. He's 5 years old, but he's just called Grandpa. I think that's hilarious. And so back in the dining room, the group spots none other than Vlad, who is sitting at a table at the opposite side of the room. And then a waiter brings a folded up napkin to them, explaining that it's from Vlad. David opens it, finding 2 bloody bullets inside, which is kind of chilling when it happens. I love how Vlad is just playing with them. Vlad's a really cool kind of villain in this. And so the group flees the hotel and rides away on their horses, only to get caught up in some fog along the cliffside. And Vlad attacks, yanking them off their horses one by one, and tells David that he's far from finished with them. David pursues him on horseback, chasing him right over the cliff, where it looks like David is falling to his death, only for a white hand to emerge from the fog and catch him right in the nick of time. And I did not do any justice at all to this scene the way I described it in my notes, but I really, really like it. It's really atmospheric and suspenseful, very well written. And it reminds me a little bit of the scene from the original movie because there's the fog in the scene where they're with Michael and they're hanging from the bottom of the train trellis, and there's like, hang on, Michael, let go, and all that, which is a really suspenseful, tense scene. It has a lot of that feeling to it, only in this period setting here, because they bring in the fog and there's the falling. I think it's a really stunningly written sequence. And then David wakes up on the beach the next morning perfectly fine, but he looks over and he sees that the horse's corpse is splattered in pieces right next to him, so he knows it wasn't all just a dream. And he walks up to the hotel where the concierge tells him that the others are fine and they're in the room they paid for, and that Vlad hasn't returned since he left the night before. And then David goes up to the room and talks to the 4 other Lost Boys, going over what happened the night before, confirming it was all real. And they seem to be saying, they're talking back and forth and saying things like, yeah, it was a dream, almost like they're trying to convince themselves that it was, even though they know it wasn't. So that's some decent dialogue writing there. And they find a letter from Vlad that's signed Vlad Tepes. So this is basically saying that he is Vlad Tepes, the Vlad the Impaler, basically saying he's Dracula without actually calling him Dracula. Only they spell that name Tepes very weird here. It's spelled Tepsch, which I've never seen it spelled like that anywhere else. That's not the phonetic spelling. But I won't give it too much crap for that, but it is, the spelling is weird. And it offers them 10 gold coins if they transport his crates from the docks to the hotel for him. And David is reluctant, but the others like the sound of the money and figure that if he didn't kill them the night before, then they should be safe. And he's looking out the window and he sees Anastasia walk into the garden, the botanical garden. So he decides he's going to go down there and talk to her, and he tells the other Lost Boys to meet him there. And I guess David has figured that his near-death experience, he might as well not miss this chance. So he goes down there, picks one of the flowers to offer her, and they talk, and she says she's been sent to America for her schooling, and it's clear that David has charmed her, but she backs off and goes away with her chaperone, saying that going with him isn't permitted. And the chaperone is, they never actually say it, but she's apparently some older female relative, because she's referred to by Anastasia as Nana in a couple scenes. So she's like a grandmother or like just an older aunt or something like that. And we then go to Victor, Radu, and Grandpa, who discover the drained corpse of a chambermaid while retrieving wine from the cellar. And the 2 brothers recognize the signs of a vampire's presence from when they lived in Romania and determined to do away with it. Now, this is a thing. This is why I'm sort of iffy about the whole Frogier brothers thing, because it's kind of a silly callback, call forward, if you say it to the original movie, to the Frog Brothers. It's like, is this just an excuse to get Corey Feldman and Jameson Newlander in here in like wigs and period costumes or something? It's an odd choice to me. And I never really thought of the Frog Brothers as being the descendants of a long line of vampire hunters who actually know what they're talking about, because I always got the impression from the original movie that they were just a couple of kids who read a lot of horror comics and they just got lucky and noticed what was going on in the town. But this doesn't really become a problem the way it plays out, so I'll leave it there. And so David and the other Lost Boys, they head into San Francisco, where they pick up Vlad's crates. And David opens a few of them, puzzled at finding only dirt, And then he opens one that's filled with gold and jewels and proposes they rob Vlad and live like kings. Okay, I'm going to have to talk about the boxes full of dirt because the sleeping in dirt thing is not one of the rules of how vampires work in The Lost Boys. In fact, you see them in the movie, they're sleeping in the cave. So unless this is just like a personality tick of Vlad, and it's not something vampires actually do, and it never really gets addressed after this scene either, so it's a bit strange. But yeah, he sees the ones filled with gold and jewels, and he proposes robbery, but before they can leave, Lomax and his goons show up, threatening David and his gang for showing up on the docks again, and they corner them on board a ship. And that's when Vlad appears, grabbing Lomax and flying off with him, killing him off camera. And the fight breaks out between the two gangs, where Vlad continues his swooping in and grabbing act all throughout the brawl. And after the fight ends, the other gang, as well as Marco and Paul, seemingly disappear. David goes down below decks to look for them, and he finds them sinking their teeth into the throat of a dead gang member. So they're kind of partially transformed at this point, I guess. And I'm not really sure how this fits in with the rules that we get in the original movie, because in the original movie, you drink the vampire's blood, and then you don't fully transform until you make your first kill, so you're kind of a half vampire before you do that. And it's I'm just not sure how the transformation works in this, because there's things we don't see. And there's things that happen later which would imply to me that they are more transformed than they should be. It's a little bit hard to parse. And they ask David not to tell the others what happened, and they emerge onto the deck where they discover what happened to the rest of Lomax's gang. They've all been dropped and impaled on the ship's mast, so they've essentially all been shish kebab, which is a very cool image. And Vlad then reappears, saying he was once known as Vlad the Impaler, and he wants the Lost Boys to show him around San Francisco and introduce him to America, and in exchange, he'll forget all about the attempted robbery and murder. And he then asks where they sleep, and when they say it, they often sleep in the streets or on the beach or wherever they can. He offers to buy the hotel for them. And we then go to Victor and Radu visiting a bookstore and consulting a book about vampires, and it's played for laughs of them like trying to talk the bookstore owner into letting them, buy the book, like acting like they know what they're doing and being like really faux serious. And it is a pretty funny scene. And they find a woodcut of Vlad eating a meal while surrounded by a forest of the impaled. Now that is an actual woodcut of the historical Vlad the Impaler eating a meal next to the people impaled on stakes. You can actually find that online fairly easily. I'm going to put that in the thumbnail, actually. And that's one of the images we have. It's from a German pamphlet that's detailing the excesses of Vlad the Impaler, his brutality and such, which is believed to at least be partially propaganda. And some of it is probably full of shit, because he did act pretty harshly against the German inhabitants of Transylvania and Wallachia when he was ruling. So some of it may have been exaggerated because they were his political enemies and his economic enemies. So you can't be sure, but it is an interesting touch that they put it in here. And obviously in the original context, it's not saying Vlad the Impaler is a vampire there. We're bringing in, the history of, how Stoker applied the name of Dracula, Vlad Dracula, which was his name, to a vampire, and we're retroactively putting that on the Vlad the Impaler like so much vampire fiction has done since. That's what we're doing here. Vlad and the Lost Boys return to the hotel and visit the casino, where Vlad uses his powers of suggestion to win big at the roulette table and kicks up a fuss when the hotel doesn't have the funds to pay him his winnings. And I like how this is done, because he's playing roulette and he's betting on a specific square for the ball to land on, and he's using his ability to manipulate people's perceptions to show it landing on the one he bet on even when it doesn't. And that's an interesting way to bring back in those abilities that you see in the original movie, like in the scene where they go back to their lair with Michael and they're feeding him rice and David's making him see maggots and he makes him see worms in the noodles. It's an interesting, call forward to that. And he then has the hotel manager put up the deed to the hotel as collateral. And of course, he wins again, taking ownership of the hotel. And then word of the new owners spreads through the hotel staff, with Victor and Radu entering the restaurant looking for new customers. Looking for the new owners, and they're so shocked when they see that it's Vlad and the Lost Boys that they comically spill water over a German count and countess. So they're basically the comic relief of the script, as the Frog Brothers were in the original to an extent. And so over dinner, Vlad finally makes his pitch to the Lost Boys, offering them eternal life. And then he offers them a wine bottle, telling them, "Let's drink to eternal life," with Jasper and Dwayne drink from without hesitation. And David is less willing, however, and questions Vlad as to what the catch is. And he drinks but spits it out, discovering that the wine is actually blood. And so there's more of the illusory powers here where Vlad is saying, it's wine, it's blood, it's wine, it's blood. And David spits it out, calling Vlad sick, and has the Lost Boys march out of there with him, only for Vlad to say that it's too late to back out and that by morning they'll need his help again, and that they should visit him at the nearby lighthouse the next evening. That night, a robber baron who accosted David in the casino earlier is attacked and killed by a vampire while in his carriage, along with the casino girl he had with him, and that's Vlad feeding again. And this is where I'm a little bit confused as to how the rules work in this specific script, because Marco and Paul were already drinking the blood of that gang member, so were they fed blood in the shadows and the fog the previous night? I'm not entirely sure what happened there, because it only specifically says in the script that Jasper and Dwayne drink the blood at the dinner table, and that they're all sort of under this spell, all four of them, and they're sort of trying to pressure David into it, but he has enough strength of presence to not do it. It's a little confusing in terms of the rules, but I do like that David is resisting a bit more, because it shows that leadership quality that he has in the original movie where everyone is willing to follow him and go along with him. I think it's really cool that they do that here. But I'm a little confused as to the timeline, the events that happen, and that's just going to get a little bit worse as this goes along, because Vlad says the next evening, and they don't come to see him for another 2 days, I'm pretty sure. And the next morning, David gets drawn under the main stairs of the hotel by Victor and Radu, who tell him about Vlad being a vampire, and they show him the book. And David starts to realize what's going on, but he plays dumb and pretends to be skeptical in front of them, and they're busy arguing over the proper way to kill a vampire, and they're just going, this is actually really funny, because they're going, but grandmother said this. No, silly, she said this. You got stuff its mouth full of garlic. No, she said garlic is just an old wives' tale, which is a nice call forward to the garlic doesn't work bit from the original movie. And so while they're arguing, David slips out, and he tries to approach Anastasia as she descends the stairs with her chaperone and some bodyguards, but he gets blocked and driven off. And then David thinks for a bit and comes up with a plan. And so we then go to that night when Anastasia and her chaperone come down for dinner. The head waiter says that the hotel owner wishes to dine with them in the ballroom. The chaperone accepts and is surprised to find David dressed to the nines and makes her apologies. Dinner goes well, and David dances with Anastasia, continuing to charm her while Vlad watches from the shadows. So he's planning some nefarious shit, to say the least. And they go sit out on the cliffs with David talking about how he used to watch the hotel from the beach and always wanted it, but now he knows he really wants her. And he even proposes coming down to San Francisco to be with her while she gets her schooling, and she gladly accepts. So the next day, it's 2 days later, David wishes Anastasia goodbye as she leaves for the city. He then goes up to the suite where he and the Lost Boys are staying and opens the drapes, letting in the sunlight, and Marco's arm gets set on fire, so bogus! That's the last one, I swear. And they realize something is wrong and decide to visit Vlad in the lighthouse that night. So yeah, he said, come to me tomorrow night because you're going to need my help. So now they're burning in the sun. So did they just sit in the suite for like 2 days? Like that whole day where they were in the where David was talking to Radu and Victor and doing his whole thing with Anastasia? Were they just sitting in the suite doing nothing for that whole day and the whole night? I'm very confused as this. And also, they're all like able to be burned by sunlight, and in the original movie that wasn't a thing because David drank the blood and he was sensitive to sunlight and wearing sunglasses, but he wasn't getting like lit up by it. So I don't know what's going on here. It's like I said, I'm very confused as to how this fits in with the rules established in that movie. And so Vlad tells them all about what it means to be a vampire, and he heals Marco and Paul by feeding them his blood. And he tries once again to get David to drink, but he still resists, bashing Vlad in the head with a crowbar and leaving him for dead. He takes the other Lost Boys with him, saying he'll take them to a doctor to get better, and they go to jump on a train heading for the city. And dawn comes as they're jumping on, and the four who are transforming, they start, lighting on fire. But David, they manage to make it aboard the train safely, though, and go to sleep. And David stays up watching them because he's afraid they're going to attack him. And so the day passes, and at dusk, back at the lighthouse, an enraged Vlad bursts through the window and flies away looking for the Lost Boys. Now, if Marco and Paul had been the only ones who were, getting lit on fire by the sun because they had already made that kill earlier on the ship, then I would actually have no problem buying into that. No, they got the blood before the other two did. That's why they're reacting now instead of those two haven't done anything yet. I'm just a little unclear as to how it's supposed to work. So night falls aboard the train, and the Lost Boys' hunger overcomes them, and they move to attack David. He flees, climbing up onto the roof of the car and jumping between them until coming to the end of the line, finding himself inside the military transport car full of Marines. And the Lost Boys burst in on them, and then Vlad shows up as well, crashing through the ceiling. And a fight ensues between the vampires and the Marines. And this is really cool the way this is written. This seems like it would have been a really cool scene. And in the process, David is shot and mortally wounded by a Marine sergeant who for some reason just shoves the gun into him and shoots him. I was very unclear as to what was going on there. And so Vlad offers him the opportunity to become a vampire once again, and David, with no other choice, nods his assent. And then we get a nice little, aside where Vlad and the other 4 Lost Boys are getting their picture taken. And then the photographer pulls the plate out and notices that they're not actually present in the picture, and then they kill him. So that's a cool little use of the period setting. And so David wakes up in bed in the hotel suite, his bullet wound healed. And when he heads into the bathroom, he now casts no reflection in the mirror. Now, that's not an inconsistency because we actually see that Michael doesn't cast a reflection, even though he's only a half vampire in the original movie. So that's not a problem, even though David hasn't made a kill yet. And then Vlad appears behind him, telling him he wants a word in the living room shortly. And so we go to that scene, and Vlad gives this big speech to the Lost Boys about serving him, saying that serving him is going to be the price of immortality, and he explains his plan. He wants to use San Francisco as a base for creating armies of vampires and conquering the world by the end of the century, saying the world will only be inhabited by us. And David, who just, the transformation has left him just totally apathetic. He doesn't care anymore. And he's totally unfazed by Vlad's threats, calls him out on his plan, making no sense. He says, who are we going to bite? Who's going to be left? Your plan isn't going to work. You're full of shit, basically, he tells him. And then he walks out, and there's a slight tremor that alarms Vlad, who isn't familiar with earthquakes, and David walks out on him. Vlad isn't worried, though, saying David won't get far. And now David is musing in the garden when Anastasia shows up, looking for him after he failed to meet her in San Francisco. And he tries to let her off lightly, explaining that he has to leave and she can't come with, but she goes in for a kiss. David almost loses control and feeds off of her, but he stops himself at the last minute. It actually shows his face transform in this sequence. And so it's kind of like a version of where Michael's hiding in the shadows in the original movie. He doesn't want Sam to see him. That kind of happens here. But he finally gets her to walk away, only for Vlad to show up and feed on her, starting her transformation as well. And once again, he only seems to drink from her, not feed her any blood, so that doesn't really work with Lost Boys rules. And so she realizes what has happened, and despite David's pleas, she leaps from the garden balustrade, and she gets impaled on the broken pylon that was once part of a pier that's not there anymore. And so she's dead. And so David is enraged, and he screams Vlad's name, Vlad, Star Trek II style. And so they go, sunrise approaches, and David confronts Vlad in the hotel lobby, who says, should we retire? And he just screams, I think he's meant to scream you, but but the way it's written in the script, it looks like he's screaming, yo! So that was unintentionally funny. So David attacks Vlad. Vlad catches him out of the air and smashes him into a wall. And that's when it happens. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake begins and the hotel starts to collapse. And I like the idea that Vlad would have won this fight because he's an older, more experienced vampire, but the earthquake gave David the advantage. I think that, it keeps, Vlad seeming like he's an actual threat to a degree while making it believable that David could still take him out. I think that's, a good bit of writing here. And so sunlight begins to stream through the cracks, burning Vlad's hand, and it kills Jasper outright. So that's why he's not in the original movie. I was kind of hoping Jasper going out would have been a bigger moment because I was wondering with this character, where is this going throughout the whole thing? Because he does not exist in the original movie. So something's got to happen to him by the end of this, unless they're sequel baiting. And unfortunately, it's just kind of like, he dies. Like, it doesn't feel like a particularly big moment in the script, which is something that could have been a bit better. So a chasm opens up in the floor, and David and Vlad fall in, with David getting his leg pinned under a rock. And Vlad, who is unencumbered like that, he grabs a piece of wood and begins jamming it into David's chest, essentially going to stake him because he's tired of his shit at this point. But David manages to break free from the rock and shove Vlad backwards, impaling him on a broken pipe sticking out of the chasm wall. And so sun shines down to the chasm, which causes David to back away, and then Vlad, who's going, you fool, it has to be made of wood, starts pulling himself off the pipe. But then the earth starts shaking again, which pushes Vlad towards the sunlight. And then David takes advantage of this, pushes the pipe the rest of the way into the light, killing Vlad for good. And I actually am going to have to read out this bit of description here because it's so well written. I have to read it out. The pipe pushes him into the white-hot wall of sunlight, close-up of Vlad's eye. The fiery sun is reflected in his cobalt blue eye. His eye explodes in flame. A great shattering explosion of flesh, bone, and blood-drenched fire as Vlad disintegrates on the metal pipe. He is gone. So yeah, that is really cool. And of course, if you've seen Near Dark, Eric Red loves his fucking exploding vampires in the sunlight, because in that movie, they don't just burn, they fucking blow up. It's a bit over the top and ridiculous, to be honest. Although the effects work is actually, it's not perfect looking, but it's pretty good looking in those scenes. So imagining that getting applied to this, it's actually pretty cool. And so the ground trembles one last time, sealing the chasm shut and forming the cave that we see in the original movie. Because in the original movie, The Lost Boys, their lair is in this cave, which is the original site of this hotel that was destroyed in the San Francisco earthquake. They do talk about that. So this is building off of that one line, and we got a whole movie out of it, interestingly. So David comes back to the surface once night falls, meeting back up with the 3 remaining Lost Boys, and taking time to mourn Jasper's death. So they do point that out. So it does have an impact of some sort. And then a carriage appears on the horizon. You're like, oh yeah, we're going to get to feed. And then as it gets closer, it has no driver. And the lone passenger inside, because it stops, invites them in. And the passenger is sitting in shadows, and he asks if they know Vlad. And he says that he is Max, Vlad's brother and the real head vampire. Now, if you remember the original movie, Max was, the twist ending essentially was that Max, the video store guy, was the real head vampire. It wasn't David like you might be thinking from watching the movie. And so you're reading this script wondering, when the hell is he going to show up? Because Vlad is nothing like Max. So it's like, what is the deal with Max? And so he shows up at the end, and he is the real original vampire. And he talks about how Vlad was he was too flashy and he drew too much attention. And he didn't understand that we have to stick to the shadows in order to survive. And that does sort of jive with his MO, where he has blended in incredibly well in that original movie, to the point where nobody even realizes he's a vampire, and he even convinces the characters that he's not. He's so good at hiding. So it kind of fits with his character here. And he's either just arrived in town or he was already in San Francisco waiting for Vlad in his hotel when the earthquake hit. I'm not entirely sure. And so they share a laugh, and there's this weird bit of description here at the end where I'm not entirely sure what it means, where it says David looks at Max, because Max says, we vampires have to stick together, and they basically tell him that Vlad didn't make it out. They don't tell him that they killed him. And so David looks at Max. He laughs knowing he's doomed. Marco laughs, then the others join in. Max laughs. So does David laughing knowing that David is doomed, or does he think that Max is doomed? I don't know what this means. It doesn't mean anything in this context. It's strange as hell. I can't figure out what the script is actually saying with this. It's a bit of a problem, if I'm being honest. And it also says 6 pairs of fangs gleam in the moonlight when there's only 5 of them, which is a bit of an oopsie. And that's when Victor and Radu approach the carriage, having survived the earthquake as well. And they remember David from before, and they don't realize he's become a vampire yet. And so they climb into the carriage after they get an invitation. And so they're very much dead. So we're not setting up the Frog family as some sort of immortal line of vampire hunters here. They're not the Belmonts from Castlevania. So it's just kind of a nod to the Frog Brothers. I don't think they're actually meant to be the ancestors of the Frog Brothers. So that fixes that problem I had from the beginning. And so they're very much dead. And then we go to the young grandpa who's watching from a distance and sipping root beer. And he breaks the 4th wall. And he says, it's one of those things, I can't believe this is the ending of the script. Boy, oh boy, there's sure going to be a lot of vampires in Santa Carla from now on. Fade out. And so so basically that little ending there is kind of mirroring the ending of the original movie in some interesting ways, where there's a twist as to who the head vampire is. And it turns out that it's Max, but it's done in a slightly different way. And we get the grandpa ending. We get all the damn vampires, but instead we get to talk about there's going to be vampires in Santa Carla now. So that's amusing, and it's an amusing enough joke. I feel like you could have... So this script, on the whole, I think the script is actually pretty good. The first half, I think, is fantastic. It's as good as anything, anything I've read. It's not the greatest script, but it is a really good first half. And then the second half where the timeline starts getting wonky and I'm starting to question how this fits into the rules of the Lost Boys a little bit more. It starts getting a little bit shakier. No pun intended because of the earthquake stuff, I swear to God, but it does get a little bit shakier as it goes along. And I feel like the second half of this thing could have been punched up a little bit, tweaked a bit. You could maybe have done a little bit less of the Frogier brothers because that's a running gag that doesn't really amount to a whole much. You can have little grandpa wandering in and out of certain scenes and observing some things. And then again, how else would he learn about the vampire stuff without the Frogier brothers, I guess? How would he know what's going on there at the end without? So that's true. So you do kind of need them to an extent, and they do provide the comic relief, and the comedy was a big part of the original Lost Boys. It had those two things balanced. So even though, and I'm guessing that, the comedy does feel a little bit out of place on the page, but I'm willing to take a guess. If you read the Lost Boys in script form, the humor doesn't quite jive with the other stuff going on around that, and that it was, the direction, the overall production quality of the thing that, kind of made those two balance so perfectly well in the original. I'm willing to bet they don't quite work as well on the page. Just saying. So, and another thing about this, this would have been really interesting to see just, putting these characters in that original setting. What the visuals would have been like with Schumacher working with this material could have been very interesting to see. And of course, the original movie has such a notable soundtrack, with most notably People Are Strange and Cry Little Sister, which is one of those songs which I don't think you can do a bad version of that. There's been like 100 covers and they're all great. Fantastic song, by the way. So I'm wondering, looking at this, would you have like kind of old-timey early 1900s versions of the songs thrown in there, a la BioShock Infinite? That could be really cool, among other things. To do that as sort of like to fit into the period setting, just to see what Schumacher would have done with this visually would have been interesting. If you can fix some of the questions I have about the timeline in that second half and some of the vampire rules stuff where I don't know what's going on, it would be a much better movie. And I think Red did a good job. I'm guessing this is a first draft, and I think it's a good starting point. I think if you did some revisions, this could have been a very good follow-up to the original movie, and it would be a worthy successor. And I do understand The Thirst is a worthy successor. Maybe this could have gotten made and The Thirst could have gotten made later. And, you could have had a nice little trilogy, just, erase the tribe from existence, I suppose. Now, I'm not entirely sure what happened with this. I've seen like one comment from Kiefer Sutherland on this project. I've not seen anybody else, really talk about it who is actually involved. And I'm guessing what happened is that, well, what Kiefer Sutherland had to say is that Schumacher got busy, Warner Brothers got busy, and I guess we're talking about, the other films he made and stuff like, like the Batman movies specifically, because he got locked into doing 2 of those in a row, basically. And they got busy, and then it got delayed so much that the actors would have been too old to play the same characters before they became vampires. So it was probably that, and I'm willing to bet some of the delays were probably to do with budget as well because of the period piece thing. And then they started spinning off into the idea. I think it was after this when they started talking about sequels and the Lost Girls and all that. So they kind of spun off the development into an entirely different direction. In fact, it's interesting to note, I have found a Lost Boys 2 script, but I can't say for sure if it's real, an official script, or if it's just fan fiction, because there's no writer listed on it. It's done up in like really like not professional formatting at all. And I glanced through it, and it seems like a fairly straightforward sequel to the original movie. Maybe I'll cover that down the line if I can find out more about it. But it's interesting enough. It's an interesting enough oddity that it's worth mentioning that I managed to find it. And it's apparently been doing the rounds online for quite some time, like at least since the early 2000s. So who knows? Maybe it's fan fiction, maybe it's real. But The Lost Boys, the beginning, I think it was an interesting direction to take a follow-up. And I found the script to be overall pretty damn good. I think if you fix that second half, it would have been something worth seeing. So yeah, that's Lost Boys, the beginning. That's about all I have left to say about it. Rest in peace, Joel Schumacher. And until next time, bye.